particular on a thread you raised, which I think is so very important in your remarks, which is this issue of the trajectory of Russian imperial sort of dominance of the region, where we think that's going, and then in particular, how you see that playing in the Central Asian context, especially with the Eurasian Union effort with very few members in the room when it was announced.
First of all, I think we're basically in agreement. There may be some differences of emphasis, but I think we're in agreement that this is an extremely complex relationship, but also in terms of the Russian-Chinese aspect of it, there is a significant asymmetry between what China can do and what Russia can do under the current circumstances. The one point with which perhaps I would emphasize different aspects or define it somewhat differently is this issue of the territorial relationship between China and Russia. It's absolutely correct that the Chinese take the position that legally everything's solved and they stick by it. But I have also been struck by the fact that in private conversations, some Chinese are beginning to bring it up, Now, where that will take them, we don't know. But in one respect, we already do know, namely the competition for influence in Central Asia, to which Mr. Rudd just referred to, is in part competition in regards to territories that in a broad sense the Chinese in the past view as somehow subordinate to their sphere of influence. And for the Russians, it's a central issue as to whether they can be incorporated into this elusive and relatively vague concept of the Eurasian Union. I spoke to one top-level Chinese official who, in kind of friendly conversation and in which we sort of talked about the last several decades and in which he talked about the future, and I realized that no conversation of that type is ever truly friendly, but at least the tone was that. He did say to me suddenly, and I want you to know that we are really moving westward. And when I heard that, I was kind of baffled for a few seconds. And thoughts flashed through my mind. Is he talking about some special relationship between China and Germany, maybe, or Western Europe or the Union? And then, of course, it quickly dawned on me, no, he was talking about Central Asia. And he started to amplifying all the different undertakings that the Chinese are pursuing, the effect of which is, of course, a more cooperative relationship with Central Asia, but also a relationship in which their influence rises and someone else's inevitably declines. And then, of course, there is the attitude of the Central Asians themselves. Part of their game right now, and that's been done diplomatically by Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, far less diplomatically by Karimov of Uzbekistan, is to limit the significance of the Eurasian Union, in part not only by open opposition or reluctance, but in part also simply by enhancing the relationship with the Chinese. Nazarbayev now always emphasizes that this is the Eurasian Economic Union, very important qualification. And Karimov, more or less bluntly, told the Russians where to go and has invited a NATO office to be opened up in Tashkent, which has a kind of echo to the previous comment. So I think this is where the contest, to some extent, is beginning, perhaps, to be nurtured. I don't think it's going to expand dramatically or rashly, but I think in the Chinese redefinition of their position in the world, they are no longer so inclined to ignore the fact that at one point, in a significant fashion, Russia benefited by expanding territorially at China's expense, and that this had geostrategic consequences for China that were negative, and that perhaps we're entering a period in which, in a subtle fashion, but a determined fashion, some of these asymmetries can now be reduced or reversed. And what happens in Russia will then affect that. If Russia at some point becomes a committed long-term enemy of the United States, it has to be associated with China and de facto as a subordinate. If Russia, however, chooses to democratize after Putin is gone, it might be able to enhance its capacity to retain its position in the Far East if it really becomes part of the West and of Europe especially. I once wrote something to the effect that in those circumstances, Vladivostok will surely and safely be Russian. But especially so if a lot of the people living in it are Germans and French and Poles and Portuguese in a more united Europe. And that, I think, is the big sort of geopolitical uncertainty that confronts this relationship. And a lot of it will depend on how the American-Chinese relationship unfolds. If we can keep it stable and cooperative, that is to the good. I refer to the Chinese, really, I think in some cases, very unnecessarily hostile or ironic articles about us. One recent example, the Chinese military organ reported on the visit by our defense secretary, Chuck Hagel, to their aircraft carrier. And they have long asked us to invite them to ours. So we invited them to ours, the Reagan one, called Reagan. And the Chinese are now making a great deal, in that particular statement, of the fact that our aircraft carrier is so much more modern, so much more effective, so much capable of being threatening than theirs, that this is an invitation deliberately designed to humiliate them. And that shows, you know, some of the potential tensions here. But I think we have to strive more seriously to avert it. They have to strive seriously to avert it. And Xinhua had just had a long editorial, for the first one that I've seen in the last 2 years, emphasizing precisely that point, that America and China have to resume striving for a genuine partnership, that things they're hinting have somewhat slipped, and that it isn't so easy just to point finger at one side and say they're all at fault. And I happen to agree with that. I think we have helped to make it more difficult and tense. They have done it too, and I think we better take a second look.
Thank you. Stape, I wanted to follow up on a comment of yours. Feel free to leave if you have to. Yeah, thanks.
Excuse me. Thank you very much.
You know, you mentioned this issue of the Chinese clearly making a compromise with regard to the gas deal in terms of how it's structured and so on. One issue that hasn't come up, and it didn't seem to come up much, at least publicly, in the Putin-Xi summit, is the whole issue of defense cooperation. And my sense is that that has started to shift as well.